This is SRM Insider.
Hi, welcome to Full Disclosure, an SRM Insider podcast. My name is Matt Mettenheimer, and I'll be your host today. With me are two of my colleagues, Michael Clark, who's the head of our U.S. Cyber Advisory practice, and Aisling Freeman, a senior associate within our cyber advisory practice here in the U.S. If you've been following our series, you'll note that we've been covering upcoming regulations from around the globe. And on today's episode, we'll be focusing on the U.S., which is where I'm currently based out of. So we're really excited to dive in here. But before we dive into any of the specifics, I want to open up to our guests, Mike and Aisling, to give us a quick overview of what are some of the upcoming regulations on the horizon for the U.S. and some of our clients need to worry about.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I think in general in the U.S., what we're seeing is really a significant change in the landscape, the regulatory landscape, with increased focus on managing cybersecurity risk and data privacy, quicker incident response reporting, and greater transparency into what the organization itself is doing in order to protect customer data, protect intellectual property, and overall and protect the investment of investors in many cases where you have those public companies. And in general, I'd say we're also seeing more requirements for better or increased oversight and governance by boards and senior leaders. And specifically with some of the regulations that we're seeing, some of these key shifts, if you will, I would say are SEC, NYDFS, CNC, as well as a number of state and local privacy laws. And Ashley, I think she can speak to probably some of the more specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Matt. Thanks, Mike. I think to Mike's point, we are really seeing the US increasingly focus on enhancing cybersecurity and data privacy across organizations. One of the biggest announcements in the last year was the SEC's implementation of the cyber disclosure rules. And this went into effect in December 2023. And it requires all public companies to disclose material cybersecurity incidents on a Form 8K within 4 business days of determining materiality. In addition to this, companies will also be required to disclose details of their processes for assessing, identifying, and managing material risks from cyber threats, and this will be disclosed on their Form 10K, in addition to disclosing any details of the board's knowledge of risks and management's role in assessing and managing material risks as well. So we're really seeing, a significant trend towards increasing transparency and accountability and the cybersecurity risk management for public companies. There's a lot of kind of chatter around materiality determination and, what constitutes a material incident. So this really is kind of requiring organizations to kind of involve different departments and different parts of the business to come together and develop a materiality framework and work on kind of defining what materiality means to their organization.
And I think, what I would add to that is the SEC cyber disclosure rule is probably one that I would say is a little bit more stringent than some of the others that we're seeing. But I think in general, right, the practices, the expectations that are being outlined, that Ashley just outlined there, as far as requirements on these public companies, are also going to trickle down to organizations that are supporting these public companies. And I think in general, we're seeing that as kind of the trend across the regulatory landscape is the regulators aren't looking to necessarily draft regulation for every industry, for every potential company out there. Instead, they're trying to create these kind of broad brush regulations that they're applying to certain types of companies where they think the impact itself will have, a little bit of that trickle down effect to hit suppliers or third-party vendors that are supporting these organizations, business partners, et cetera, right? And so with that, I think what we're going to see is a lot of the organizations that are required to adhere to SEC, for example, they're going to take steps in order to improve their control environment. They're going to take steps in order to make sure that they're in adherence. But I think there might, in some cases, be a little bit of a blind spot where they're not fully thinking through, well, what's going to be that impact of outsourcing particular services or relying on vendors, suppliers to support operations. What is the impact there, and how does that now also roll up into my requirements? So probably a good example, which we've seen with some of our clients, is we've asked them in conversations, hey, you have an incident response plan, you have an incident response process, but this particular operation is 80% outsourced to a vendor supplier. How are you comfortable that vendor supplier is going to be able to give you the information you need in a timely fashion so that you can, one, determine if it's a material impact, and then two, meet your reporting requirements based on what the SEC has outlined here for you. And, in some cases we get a pretty good answer, but in most cases it's kind of we're still figuring it out. We haven't thought through that yet. And, we're drafting those plans now. Well, the rule technically is in effect, so in some ways, drafting it now is a little bit behind the bell curve, which is fine. Like, I don't think you're going to see today that you're going to have organizations that are going to get hit with major fines or nonconformities right out of the gate. But I think that this first year is kind of the freebie, and as we roll into the second year, we're going to see more and more scrutiny. We're going to see the SEC taking a little bit more heavy-handed approach to how they look at these organizations and kind of start to force others to get in line by making examples out of let's call it the first few folks, right?
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you both giving that overview. I mean, that is quite a bit of a change up than what we've seen historically, right? Aisling, you noted that every publicly traded company in the U.S. now has to follow these guidelines on reporting, but they also have to include it in their 8K and their 10K. That's a pretty big shift from what we're seeing from a lot of organizations who historically have always tried to keep a lot of their security program, close to the vest, so to speak. But now they have to come out right in the open, disclose how they're going to go through reporting and what their materiality changes are, but also that kind of increased awareness on who are you doing business with and what is your program taking for those proactive steps. Mike, I love that you called out that this is not just one organization that has to be compliant or think through their own security controls, but also how they're dealing with their vendor management systems and who they're doing business with, because they also could have access to some sensitive data or materially impact a breach, which would require that disclosure. And I think that's a really interesting change that we're seeing in the U.S. regulatory landscape is, one, that emphasis on transparency you both hit on it, and then two, additionally, the mechanism that even if you aren't technically required to be in compliance with this regulation, who you do business with might inadvertently fall again to compliance with these regulations, because they're required to transfer some of these controls to you as a vendor. That's a really interesting change up. And I know we're talking about SEC, but you mentioned a few other regulations that I think mirror this. Could you tell me a little bit about CMMC that you noted when you first gave the overview? And is there some similarities with what's going on with SEC, or are there some differences? And what really is CMMC and how may it impact some of our clients?
Sure. Well, if you're not familiar with the CMMC, it's a cybersecurity maturity model certification. And it's basically a standard which requires the implementation of cybersecurity controls across the Department of Defense supply chain. So it applies to all contractors and subcontractors that are responsible for protecting controlled unclassified information, otherwise known as CUI, and federal contract information, FCI. The CMMC 2.0, which was announced this year, it's an update to their framework. Again, just enhancing cybersecurity across that defense industrial base. And it aims just kind of on enhancing those controls that they already had in place to protect CUI and FCI. So the new framework streamlines the model now into 3 levels. It was previously an additional amount. So the first level is foundational. These are just best practices for handling FCI, but the levels 2 and 3, advanced and expert, these require a third-party assessment now. And this is aligned with NIST's SP 800-171. And this is for all companies that are handling CUI. And then the expert level, it's more complex practices for critical programs. And that aligns with a subset of NIST 800-172. And really, the CMMC preparing for and passing third-party assessments for level 2 and 3, this is going to require significant effort and expertise for organizations that need to be compliant with this regulation.
The only thing I would add to that is on the surface, CMMC and SEC have very similar requirements in expectations of organizations from a cyber risk management kind of best practices or cyber risk management program expectations. However, CMMC is really more for if you're supporting DoD, if you're a defense contractor, versus SEC's cyber disclosure rule is public companies, right? And those companies that are supporting those companies and business partners that are supporting or doing business with public companies. And so I'd say that's probably one of the biggest differences. I mean, there are some other underlying differences in disclosure requirements and all of that are also unique to each one of those. But generally speaking, the target organizations that have to adhere to those is probably one of the biggest differences. But again, I think what you're seeing is that while the industries are different, obviously TOD versus public companies, they're different, have different missions. Across the U.S., again, you're going to continue to see more and more regulatory or enhanced regulatory scrutiny requirements around cyber risk management. And, you've got, again, NYDFS, which in some ways is very similar to SEC, FTC, which in some ways is also very similar to SEC, and, a number, again, of state and local kind of regulations that are going to be driving increased data privacy requirements. Similar to that, what we're seeing out of California with the CPRA now, I believe, which is, again, similar to GDPR out of Europe, right? And so we're going to continue to see more and more push here because we're seeing that the threat actors are getting more sophisticated. They're taking they're applying new technologies in order to create more unique approaches to how they get data, how they impact operations. And that's both at the nation state level, as well as your kind of, run-of-the-mill cyber criminal who's just trying to get a buck out of you, right? And so all of this comes together to really play into the need for companies to take a close look, a microscope, put their programs under a microscope and understand what are we doing well and what are we not doing not so well? Where are we meeting those expectations and where are we short of the expectations? And in some cases where we're even meeting those expectations based on our industry, based on our business, is meeting them enough? Or should we start to really think about where should I have kind of I always like to coin it as the platinum program versus the Toyota Prius, right, program. So all of this new regulation is really designed to start forcing organizations, and many of them are already doing this, and they're trying to do the right thing. They're putting the right practices and processes in place, but it's really all designed to be a forcing mechanism to bring the rest of the herd along, so to speak. Where again, you've got industries, or you've got companies that are supporting industries that tend to be a little bit more heavily regulated, financial services, healthcare, pharma, and then you've got big tech and other industries that aren't necessarily as regulated, but they've got tons of consumer data. They got tons of information on the U.S. population, and so again, all of this is really kind of meant to be a forcing mechanism to say, okay, hey, for those who have this data, those who have the potential to impact our critical infrastructure, which our financial systems are also part of our critical infrastructure for those who are unaware. But for those who have who operate, in these sort of areas and have this sort of information, what are you doing to take the right steps to ensure that you've got the right safeguards in place? But what are you also doing to make sure that the folks that you're doing business with, that they've got the right safeguards and mechanisms in place to also protect data or critical infrastructure or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. No, and I think that's great. And something that while you were talking that through was that came to the top of my mind was the U.S. looks a bit different than some of the other world stages when you look at regulations. You noted that the SECs for the publicly disclosed companies, CMMC is related to only organizations that do work with the Department of Defense or work with a contractor who directly works with the Department of Defense. You also mentioned CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, NYDFS, and a few other regulations. And I think something for our listeners to think about when you are looking at U.S. regulations, we don't typically see a one-size-fits-all model. It sounds like we have specific industries and regulatory bodies for those industries try to push forward some best practices and get their industry up to a certain level of maturity, which though has that cascading effect of bringing the rest of the U.S. or companies based here to be aligned with those standards, even if they're not directly applicable to the business itself. And that sounds like it could be a really big challenge to stay on top of if you are one of these large organizations that has multiple different divisions that work in different states or different localities, has different types of service offerings or products, works with the government, doesn't work with the government, potentially if you are involved in the financial sector. That seems like it can be really difficult to stay on top of all these kind of changing regulations. Do you see that as an issue with some of the clients you've worked with in the past, that they have difficulties staying on top of understanding what regulations are applicable for them? Or even if they do know what regulations are applicable for them, how they respond to it or some of the challenges that they face when trying to get compliant with these various different regs?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it can be difficult, right, as organizations try to kind of stay ahead and stay up to date with all of these new regulatory implications and regulations that are coming out. So I think it's important for all organizations to kind of stay, in contact with regulatory agencies so that they're receiving updated information and kind of sharing information across industries and government agencies. Implementing any kind of tools that they have to kind of streamline their compliance efforts so that they can stay ahead and stay up to date with these regulations. As well as that, it's important to kind of engage with the experts, right, to help you navigate some of these complexities as well and prepare for assessments or any audits that might be coming down the road as well. So there's kind of a group effort and there's a lot of things that organizations should be doing to stay ahead. So as best they can to kind of stay in the know and as you said, I think we're going to start seeing more and more states and other regulatory bodies kind of enforcing different regulations and imposing penalties for these as well. So it's just important for organizations to stay up to date if they can.
I would agree. I think the only piece that I would add to what Aisling outlined, which I think hit the nail on the head there, is also just working with your general counsel. I think in general, right, that should probably be, in many cases, your starting point is, working with the legal team at your organization. They have them kind of help you understand, hey, how do we interpret these regulations that are coming out, or what are some of the, whispers of regulations that are going to be coming out, and what is the potential impact to us? And then again, echoing what Aisling again just said, reaching out to those experts outside the organization. I know we've got a ton of smart folks that work within all of these companies, right? But I think sometimes, having that outside view where you get an objective opinion of where you are, what the interpretation of what their interpretation of the regulation is, can sometimes just help to find the right balance. Because I think I look across our client base, and We sometimes will have conversations with clients where their legal interprets a regulation one way, and we may interpret it slightly different. And I think we're both, doing our best to try to find what is that balance for the organization that's going to get them in the right place, right, where they're not downplaying or underselling the impact, where a lot of times an outside objective view can come in and give you that perspective of really, if I was in my conversations with the regulators, this is kind of what I'm hearing, right? In my conversations with your peers and your competitors, here's where we're seeing them, the steps that they're taking in order to shore up their own organization. And so it also gives you a little bit of both, right? Both the comparison, that benchmarking that you can use to say, okay, do we want to fall behind our peers? Because now we're also potentially less competitive in the space if our peers are taking XYZ steps and we're only taking X step. And so a long-winded way of saying that all of this has to be considered and kind of brought together with leadership teams, with general counsel, with regulatory bodies and agencies to figure out what's the right fit for each organization, because that's going to be truly unique. There's going to be clear expectations that have to be complied with. And then there's that gray area of, okay, well, how do we get there in a way that makes sense for our organization?
Yeah. And I think that's a great call out. Aisling, you mentioned it, working with your general counsel, working with your trusted advisors. I always like to say cybersecurity is a team sport. You need to make sure everyone's running on the same playbook, understanding what's the impact for our organization, and then how do we tackle it together? Because a lot of these regulations, they are complex. They are going to require you working with your general counsel or working with your trusted advisors, such as SRM, to really create that game plan of what does our environment look like today, and what are we doing and can utilize to build out the program to get in compliance off of the great foundation we've already worked for years on. So I think that's really important to make sure that you are working with your trusted advisors, your general counsel, your CISOs, but also your CIOs and your COOs to understand how does this regulation affect us from a security perspective, but also from that operations perspective, so that we can get ahead of it and be in compliance, hopefully before the actual requirement dates start. I know that's something that can be really difficult for organizations. And I've seen over my career, whenever there's a new regulation come on board, a lot of businesses will worry about it once it starts getting a little bit closer. If it's a year out, they'll say they'll worry about it 6 months before the due date. But really, that could put you in an adverse position if you don't stay on top of it or don't take those proactive steps of working with your general counsel or advisors to understand what's the real uplift here. Because it might be simple that, hey, our program's very solid. We might have to do some tailoring, but we're most of the way in compliance with this regulation. But if you don't get that outside perspective, you might realize with 3 months until the go live date that you have a whole program that you need to build out from scratch, and it can take quite a bit of uplift. And it's really difficult to build a program in that, time pressure. So getting ahead of it, making sure that we are working with that counsel, are working with our trusted advisors to understand what that long-term roadmap looks like, I think is really key. Mike, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Matt, I fully agree. And, I want to go back to something you said about cybersecurity being really a team sport. And I know something, we always say, right, is that it's a journey, it's a marathon. It's not a destination. And, as we think about what we're seeing across our clients, right, when it comes to the CISO's role and their relationship with the CIO, relationship with senior leaders in the organizations, I think it's going to become more and more important for those CISOs to have a bigger foot or bigger voice in the boardroom at the table with leaders, and also making sure that they're supported by leaders across the organization, And again, kind of picking on the SEC cyber disclosure rule, right? When you look at that rule requires understanding materiality of a cyber incident based on the impact to operations, reputation, financials, and all of those different areas don't sit under a lot of those different areas, I should say, aren't necessarily nested under the CISO. And so in that case, the CISO has to work with leaders across the organization in order to build out, okay, well, what's materiality for us as it relates to if we had an incident and it impacted, these systems, which are our financial systems or whatever systems, right? What's going to be the potential operational impact? What's going to be the potential financial impact? That's going to take a community effort of the senior leadership team coming together to find that. And that can't sit purely with the CISO. That can't sit purely on the CISO. And I think as we look at some of what we're seeing with, let's take the SolarWinds incident, right, where it's not exactly under this new SEC cybersecurity disclosure rule, but I think it's a close comparison in what the potential impact could be if we don't get this right. In that regulators, or in particular, we'll say the SEC in this case, it's going to be looking at the organization and say, hey, what did we do in order to make sure that we are able to comply with this regulation, and were we properly supported by the organization's leadership team in order to comply and meet the requirements that are outlined here. And in some cases, I think you're going to see that it won't just fall on just the CISO. You're going to see that the COO, the CFO, other folks in that C-suite are going to take a bit of a hit here, right? And so I say, again, it's going back to your earlier point, it's really a team sport. And be it, just to stay out of trouble, or be it because you want to see things happen the right way, which I hope is more the latter than the first. It's really going to take, the organization coming together with the various leaders and defining what does right look like for us, and also supporting the CISO in a way that allows, him or her to be effective and make impact at the organization. Just because I know a lot of conversations that I've had, or I should say too many conversations that I've had, have been CISOs feeling that their arms are a bit tied and they're just trying to, in many ways, get to the next year, right? And so getting to the next year sometimes means not raising the alarms where they should be raising the alarms. And I get it, no one wants to be chicken little, the sky's falling. And so, of course, they're striking that balance. But in essence, I would say that security leaders, CISOs, have to have a voice that is heard, and they have to be able to actually do their job. And their job is to bring and raise concerns that the business can then use in their decision making. Which again, there's going to be times where you're at the business, you're going to say, hey, we're going to accept the risk, we understand it, or we're going to accept it. But you should at least be able to have and engage in that conversation to outline what are our compensating controls, what is our rationalization for why we decide to go ahead and accept this risk, so that it's a smart business decision versus the blind spot.
No, I love that call out. And in my personal experience, some of the strongest organizations I've ever worked with was where the CISO or the CIO or the COO really do always come back together and understand, hey, what is the mission for our business? How can we use that mission to drive everything we do here, and understand what those security concerns may be, and use that to prioritize? Because you're right, it's not always going to be about the amount of data impacted. It could be, if you're a large manufacturer who are publicly traded, that your data might be important, but what really is material for your business is making sure your manufacturing sites stay online and continue to work 24/7. I've had a lot of conversations where I'll go into a room with a COO who says the most important part of our business is making sure our sites stay online. And if they are communicating well with the CIO or the CISO will mirror some level of the same discourse, that making sure that we protect our plants are our top priority, rather than understanding that, hey, our internal IT systems might be our crown jewels. So really working together across that team, I think can really make a program a lot more strong, but also just be a little bit more transparent with it themselves that this is going to be our material impact, and let's build out our defense in depth capabilities with that in mind and get some of those top priorities remediated first. I know, Aisling, this conversation reminds me of a client of ours where we did a tabletop exercise that had very little to do with actual data being disclosed, but the operational impact of a key supplier not being able to provide a key component of their product, so to speak. I would love to hear your thoughts on, that kind of example and how that plays into materiality.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, right? I think what we're starting to see, and I know that we've conducted several already this year with different organizations, specifically ones that have that reporting timeline to report material incidents. And that's something that we're starting to think through with a lot of our clients as well, right? As we're going through and conducting our annual tabletops, there's also a portion of that is, right, reporting to the SEC and talking through with the different stakeholders from different parts of the organization. What does that process look like? Have you thought that through? And a lot of organizations have not, right? They're still kind of going through that. What is a material incident? What does materiality look like for my organization? But, as well as kind of developing that framework and, getting to the best of your ability, that materiality definition included as part of your company's risk management strategy. It also needs to be exercised, and the reporting process and approval process for reporting those incidents also will need to be exercised as part of an organization, because you don't want it to come to a point where, you are going through an incident and, it's something that needs to be reported on, and, you don't have your Form 8K, you don't have a draft of that ready to go. You haven't worked with legal, you haven't worked with different stakeholders. And so, that kind of timeline of that four-day window is getting tighter and tighter, right? And, any amendments to your Form 8K have to be refiled as well. And I think what we actually haven't touched on as well is, we're also starting to see threat actors report to the SEC now. And they're kind of using that as leverage to, for their ransom payments to be paid out a lot faster. So I think we saw an example of that with the Black Cat ransomware group reported an incident to the SEC on behalf of an organization that they had, they had been waiting for a ransom payment from an organization. I think we're going to start to see that more and more as, these public companies are kind of going through different incidents. So, it's something that's really important, and it's something that organizations need to be best prepared for.
Just gotta say, Ash, I think that's a really, really good point, right? Really proactively, just trying to proactively get ahead of this stuff versus waiting for an incident to define materiality, to figure out your materiality, but instead define it as best you can, establish those frameworks as best you can up front, so that when you get into that, when an incident occurs, I always like to say when, because if you think about it, it's not really a matter of if these days, it's really a matter of when, or you're going to get hit, right? So anyhow, when an incident occurs, you're able to rapidly, or at least more quickly, identify if it's material, and then start that communication process, that reporting process to the appropriate channels, versus kind of waiting on the back end. Because I think what we're also going to see, and Ashley, I think you called this out really well, but what we're also going to see is, as the SEC gets a little bit more stringent on how they're going to manage this regulation, and not just the SEC but other regulatory bodies as well, how they're going to kind of enforce these various regulations. I think you're going to see companies that are kind of sitting back and waiting be the first ones to become the examples, right? Of, hey, and trying to point to, hey, it took me 30 days to figure out materiality before I can report it within that window. And so to me, that was a reasonable time that it should have taken. And I think you're going to see the SEC and some of these other regulatory bodies push back and say, well, no, as you've taken these steps proactively or ahead of time, it should have taken you no less than a week to figure this out. But because you hadn't built those frameworks, you hadn't defined materiality, you hadn't thought through it, that's why it took you 30 days. And so we're going to essentially see you as being somewhat willfully negligent in this process. And so you're going to get fined, or at worst, which again, I think you'd have to probably do something that was very, very negligent or extremely negligent to get to the point where someone's going to jail. But I think we will have an example of that as well at some point.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is you want to be the organization that stays in front of these challenges. You don't want to be determining materiality while your house is on fire, so to speak. You want to come in with that game plan so that it's crystal clear what, is required to be a reportable event versus when do we not necessarily need to disclose this information because it didn't cross that threshold. But you most certainly don't want to be left at the whims of the threat actor reporting on your behalf because you haven't been able to determine materiality yet. That's obviously not a great look if you're a business that the threat actor is proactively reporting for you. And I think it is an interesting tool that they're starting to leverage, that these disclosures need to be done timely. If not, it's going to come out one way or the other. You want to be able to control the narrative and understand what that impact looks like rather than having to respond to the disclosure of a threat actor group, which is really an interesting shift, seeing that threat actors are also using these regulations for their benefit, not just for the security of a business. But I think it always comes back down to how do we understand what our risks is and how do we stay up in front of it to make sure that we are doing our due diligence, that we are staying proactive with these regulations, but just cyber risk in general, to make sure that our organization has the best chance for when a cyber incident occurs. Because I love what you said, Mike. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And you want to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row prior to that day. I know we're coming up on time here shortly, but I really have been enjoying this conversation and really love both your insights on what's currently going on around the U.S. because it is pretty difficult to stay on top of this. As we noted, there isn't usually one authoritative source. It's related to your specific industry or the geolocation you're in or what type of services you provide your customers. And also who you do business with, who your clients are and if they have any regulatory impacts and how that trickles down to your business. But I really wanted to open the floor to the both of you to see if there's anything else you want to bring top of mind for our listeners or that they should take away from this this episode so that they can understand what some of the regulations on the horizon and how they should be thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think, as we kind of said at the start of the call, right, we're seeing the US increasingly focus on enhancing and implementing stricter cybersecurity controls across organizations. We're also going to, I think, continue to see the trend of this across, local and state laws as well. We mentioned Florida, but I know that Virginia and California also have their Consumer Data Protection Acts. And I think we're gonna start to see other states implementing, some robust and cybersecurity and privacy laws protecting, consumer data and privacy around and additional privacy laws. I think one thing that, we've kind of touched on, some of the penalties for non-compliance, but I think one thing to note as well, and I think we talked a lot about the SEC, but, for CMMC, non-compliance will result in loss of their existing federal contracts and potential disqualification from future defense contracts as well. So this is a really significant implication for defense contractors and subcontractors as well. So we're really starting to see, any of our, clients that are, have to be in compliance with CMMC 2.0, really clamping down and kind of increasing and investing in their cybersecurity programs to get compliant with these regulations as well.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is we didn't talk a lot about it, but it's certainly something that is on the horizon, and in many cases is also in the works of regulations around AI. I think as we look at some of these existing regulations that we talk through, I think they're going to be equally as applicable to AI, but there's also going to be unique regulation coming out around the use of AI with organizations. What does that mean from a data privacy impact standpoint, from a consumer, from a consumer's data impact standpoint? And so I think that's probably going to be a podcast for another day, because we could probably spend a whole hour talking about that. But I think, just also keeping AI kind of top of mind, right? As you go through and look at your cyber programs and look at your business and your industry kind of objectives, and what are you trying to achieve, and what are your use cases for AI, making sure that those use cases are also weighed and balanced against the security and the data privacy controls that you should be weaving into the implementation of these various technologies and systems.
No, great call out from both of you. I think you're right, Aisling. It is important. These regulations, sometimes organizations think of them as a checkbox, but they do have material impacts to your business. If you're unable to get in compliance with them, this may result in you losing business, all of a sudden being dropped as a vendor by one of your customers. So they are important, not just from a security perspective, but also from the health of your operations. So taking it seriously, understanding those challenges, and as you said, Mike, making sure that you are forward-looking, that any innovation that you are doing, especially around the AI space, that you also keep a close eye on as well, because all of these things will compound into how your business has to move forward to maintain compliance with regulations in 2024 and beyond. So I think those are some really great takeaways. And I really appreciate both of you joining this episode of Full Disclosure. And I appreciate all the listeners listening in and enjoyed our time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Matt.
We are SRM. Search your first call to find out more.